Hello, everybody. It has been a very strange week. Well, it's been a very strange few years if you live in the country of America, the increasingly less democratic country of America. But fortunately, I am here with somebody who can explain it all for us. Peter Montgomery, Head of Right Wing Watch, Senior Fellow and Research Director at People for the American Way. We have been sort of watching with bated breath everything that's happening at these January 6th committee hearings. Could you explain it to people who maybe haven't, what's going on?
Sure. There's a lot going on, and there's going to be several more hearings over the next couple of weeks. So in some ways, they're just getting started. And the committee is really trying to carefully lay out the case that Donald Trump was involved in a large criminal conspiracy against the country to overthrow the election. So they're really making sure not to just focus on what happened on January 6th, on the violence that happened at the Capitol and the people who broke windows and went hunting for members of Congress. So they're really focusing on what led up to that, the lies that were told by Trump and so many of his supporters, the lies that really inflamed the rage of Trump supporters who falsely believed that the election had been stolen from him. So that's really a focus of their investigation. And in one of the first hearing, really looked at what Trump knew about the election, how many of his own advisors told him that what he was saying about the stolen election was wrong, how many of his own inner circle told him that the really wild and incredible claims by people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani about Dominion voting machines somehow being controlled by Hugo Chavez or people in Italy or China, that those were just in former Attorney General William Barr's words, they were bullshit. And people told Trump that, and yet he kept repeating those lies. And he used those lies to mobilize anger. So that was really a big focus of the first hearing, was really laying out the case through testimony from Trump insiders that Trump knew that his claims were false, even as he kept promoting them, and promoting them with really devastating consequences. The hearing that's going on right now, as we're speaking, is a hearing that looks at specifically the pressure that Trump and his team mobilized against Mike Pence. And people recall that, after the effort that the Trump and his team made after the election in November, December, they filed a bunch of lawsuits challenging Biden's victories in battleground states. They tried to get the state legislatures to overturn those elections, and they were not successful. And so they really, starting in December, they really became desperate and focused their pressure on Mike Pence. And lawyers like John Eastman and Jenna Ellis, who were working with Trump and the Stop the Steal campaign, started concocting these theories that said supposedly that Mike Pence had the authority to just refuse to count votes on January 6th. What was happening on January 6th, it's just laid out in the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, is that, the states met, they certified their electoral college votes. Those votes got sent to Washington, and on January 6th was the constitutional procedure for having those votes counted. And as vice president, Pence oversaw the Senate. He was in charge of opening those votes and overseeing the vote by members of Congress. Now, what Trump's team decided to try to convince Pence was that he had the unilateral authority during that process to just reject some of those votes, to refuse to count votes from battleground states that Trump thought he won or said he won, even though Biden had been certified as the winner. And so today's hearing was kind of digging into the weeds on the conversations between the lawyers and Trump advisors who were pressing that claim, and people who knew that the claim was just wrong, which included Vice President Pence, Vice President Pence's chief of staff, and his lawyers. So we're really hearing today about how they withstood the pressure from Trump himself to basically overturn the election unilaterally.
Well, and so you've sort of answered this already. What would you say to people who are, because I'm seeing a lot of this, right? People who are like, I don't have the capacity to care about this anymore. Trump is old news. I want to move on. How are you all dealing with that? And because you are researching the future of more violence exactly like this. How do you express to people the urgency of what we're seeing right now?
I would say there's a couple ways to answer that question. One is to say that history, not only in our country, but in other places in the world, history says if there's an attempted coup and people are not held accountable for that or punished for it, then they will see it as a trial run, as a practice run, and they'll be back again to try another coup. And so it's very important, not only that the people who battled with the police officers and trashed the Capitol and went looking for members of Congress, that not only they are held accountable, and hundreds of them have been arrested and charged, but that the people who inspired them and called them to come to Washington and stirred up their anger with these false claims, that all those people are held accountable. So the truth telling that this committee is doing is very important, because telling the truth is the first step in accountability. It's not the last step. There are Trump officials who are defying subpoenas for the committee that need to be held accountable. We hope the Justice Department is going to hold more of them accountable. But getting the truth out there is the first step. And so that's why this committee process is so important. The second thing I would say is for people who are, think this is all in the past, is that there are Trump Republicans all over the country continuing to make these false claims about the election. They're using it to run for office. They're using it to fire up conservative voters in primaries to try to get the most Trump-supporting MAGA Republicans elected. We have, dozens and dozens of those kind of Republicans winning their primaries. We've got people who are running for offices, not only at local levels, but for state legislators, to be election officials, in some cases to be secretaries of state, where they're going to be overseeing the 2024 elections. Trump is really trying to put his people into place to carry out what he couldn't carry out this time, because election officials in places like Georgia and Arizona, they held on to their integrity. They did not give in to Trump when he tried to bully them. Even these Republican officials did not give in to Trump's bullying to overturn the elections. So he's trying to get loyalists in those positions so that the next time the coup can be more successful. So I would say that, that's one reason we can't look away, is that the lies that led to the insurrection and the attack on the Capitol are the same lies that are being used to justify new voter suppression laws in states that are meant to make it harder for some people to vote, to try to rig the elections in favor of people like Trump. And they're being used to try to elect Trump loyalists into positions where they will have control over elections in the future. And that could have really devastating consequences for the democracy. So those are...
No, sorry, I cut you off.
I was just going to say, those are some reasons that people should care.
It's rough, right? Because how do you, go around and be like, hey, election laws are really important. The person that counts the ballots, that's a big deal. And I do think I understand why people are fatigued, but yeah, you're right. They're moving rapidly to make sure this happens again and again and again. I asked you this in pre-show. What has surprised you the most about watching these hearings and things play out?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because as someone who has played, very close attention, who's paid very close attention to the Stop the Steal movement and everything that's happened since then, I would say there's not a lot that's been really surprising, but it's been really fascinating to get an insider's view. I mean, one of the interesting strategies that the committee has obviously chosen is to make the case against Trump using Trump Republicans. So all the witnesses that have been brought before the committee, the testimony that they're playing, these aren't liberal activists, these aren't Democrats. These are people who worked for Donald Trump, people who worked for Mike Pence, people who have spent their lives in the conservative movement. One of the people today was a very conservative retired judge, Michael Ludig, to try to make the case to people. Anyway, so that has been fascinating, and to hear them describe the conversations. I mean, it really kind of puts you into these rooms in the White House and in the Oval Office, where Donald Trump is there badgering Mike Pence, or one of Team Trump's lawyers, a guy named John Eastman, who has a long history as a far-right lawyer and activist on all kinds of issues. He's horrible on immigration. He's a long-time anti-LGBTQ equality activist, and he became one of the leaders of this effort to concoct, legal theories that would justify Mike Pence unilaterally claiming the power to decide who's president. And to sort of, I think the testimony sort of put us in those rooms where you had, again, very conservative people pushing back on this, pushing back on Eastman's claims. And it was heartening to me, because it said, here are people who I probably, on political issues, don't agree with on just about anything. And yet they were saying to Trump, in the face of fierce pressure and bullying from him, we do believe in the Constitution. It's important to us. Abiding by the law and the Constitution is more important to us than staying in power, which was clearly the opposite for Trump. The only thing that mattered to Trump was staying in power. He didn't care what laws he had to break, what laws Mike Pence would have to break in order to stay in power. So I thought it was very revealing and heartening to see this testimony from people who were in the inner circle, who were bucking up Mike Pence, who did not want to overturn the election, even though he had been Trump's loyalist, all through the election and after. He did not want to go down in history as someone who ripped up the Constitution. And so I thought that was heartening. Now, what's disheartening is that there are so few Republicans in public office who are willing to take the same stand. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger have been completely trashed by Trump and Trump Republicans. Liz Cheney's been totally disavowed by her state Republican Party because they're willing to hold Trump accountable for his lies and for the damage he did to democracy. So they are great role models. I think the attorneys, the people that we've seen testifying, are great role models for their fellow Republicans to say, either you really do believe in democracy and you believe in the Constitution and the rule of law, or you just believe in Trump and in maintaining power at all costs. And I think that is a huge identity crisis and divide in the Republican Party right now. And I unfortunately think the evidence is that Trump is winning most of the party to his side on that. And that's, we see this rising, support for authoritarianism on the right.
Well, and Peter, so, normally I say this in the intro, but I was just so excited to talk to you. This show, we discuss sort of how political and cultural trends intermarry and reinforce one another. You're the expert on right-wing extremism. Is there something in American culture, or is there something that we should have seen a long time ago that sort of sowed the seeds for what we're seeing right now, where you're right, this is becoming normalized. This is becoming what it is to be a Republican, which in a two-party system should terrify all of us.
Yeah, I would say that there are a lot of horrifying things in our history that are anti-democratic, that are violent. Uh, you know, our initial conquest of the Indians, the civil slavery, Jim Crow after the Civil War, when the backlash to Reconstruction and the empowerment of Black people led to this decades of brutal violence and lynching and legal segregation. So there's a lot of precedent for authoritarian movements in the United States and for oppressive governance in the United States. I think what we're seeing now is the fruits of some long cultivated backlash to the progress that was made in this country. Particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, we had the passage of civil rights legislation, really, guaranteeing finally political access and equality to Black Americans. We had Supreme Court rulings upholding the separation of church and state and religious pluralism. We have had changes to immigration laws to make them less racist, and those have led to increasing ethnic and cultural and religious diversity in the United States. Some of us see that as a wonderful thing. Some people see that as a threat to, this vision they have of a conservative white Christian America. And we have the feminist movement, the gay rights movement. There's a tremendous amount of progress that was made toward a more fully inclusive, multi-ethnic, multiracial society. And some people don't like that. And so we've also had, at least 40 years of the building of a right-wing movement by, very strategically, hugely funded by corporate foundations and right-wing corporate donors that have built a movement that has steadily taken over the courts, brought us the Supreme Court we have today. They've helped move the Republican Party far to the right of where it was. Republicans tend to sort of deify Ronald Reagan, but the Republicans that are in Congress now are far to the right of the Republicans who were in Congress during the Reagan era. And that's the result of right-wing organizing. So, and a lot of this, just was pushed to fast forward when Trump came to office. Trump's election his campaign just really energized the white nationalists in the country, because he started off with this just a brazen attack on immigrants and immigration. He really mobilized and energized conservative white evangelicals who saw, Barack Obama as an existential threat to their vision of the country, and who were, deeply resentful about the support that the Obama administration gave to the LGBTQ community. So Trump really came in mobilizing a lot of the resentment that was out there on the right. And that has unleashed, all kinds of awfulness, of people being willing to openly express bigotries that they hadn't before, to act on them. And it has led to, plenty of other politicians and wannabe politicians who want to be the next Trump, or who want to be Trump-like, running for office around the country. We've got movements trying to build power based on smearing LGBTQ people as groomers and as threats to children. It's a multifaceted political backlash that we're dealing with, and it is these are people who are conservative white evangelicals in this country who are Trump's most ardent supporters. It's also been documented by scholars that is the group that is most likely to embrace authoritarianism. It is the most likely group in the country to say that true patriots may have to resort to violence to save America. The kind of violence that we saw on January 6th and the kinds of violence that we have seen threatened in other places around the country. So it does feel like we're at a dangerous time. It's not the first time that we have, faced right-wing violence in this country, certainly, but it's on the upsurge. We see, the rise of like a really aggressive, far right presence showing up at gay pride events, at LGBTQ pride events this month. Armed, Patriot Front folks who showed up in Idaho, prepared to riot. So there's a lot out there to be very concerned about, and that reaffirms, one of my basic points, which is the people who fomented the violence, who tried to overturn the election, must be held accountable, because if they are not held accountable, it just signals all the people waiting in the wings that they can get away with what they want to do next.
I love that you say that, because it's so basic, and yet it has to be explained. I don't think people realize, if somebody sees somebody who marches in the Capitol, their lives ruined, they get locked away, they're not going to participate in those types of right-wing, like, human behavior is very nuanced, but also sometimes it's not, right? And if we just continue to write these people off as a few loony people, they're going to get more powerful, especially because I love what you said about this actually isn't out of character for this country. It's very in line with a lot of our history, and it's really the advances that were new. And I think it's difficult for people, especially people raised with, well, that's just who we are as America. We're progressive, we're egalitarian, but not really. Actually, there is a strong history of slavery, of patriarchy, of hate. And we have to grapple with the fact that there are a lot of people who don't want things to be good for everyone. They want to continue to, the America First rhetoric comes from the KKK.
Yeah, right. Even the fact that Trump embraced that rhetoric was a signal to people, right? That was another thing the white nationalist crowd loved about him, because that had the history of that phrase was really grounded in the same kind of anti-Semitism and racism that is now, really brazenly embraced by the far right. And one of the dangerous things that has happened not just under Trump, has been happening for a longer time than Trump, but really accelerated under Trump, was the breaking down of lines between what you would consider the traditional right or the conservative right and the far right and the really far right, right? There's just been a bleeding of, and the one of the best examples of that is Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Here he is, one of the highest rated people. He's got a huge audience. Republican politicians love to go on his show, and he's promoting great replacement theory, which is at the heart of the kind of resentment that white nationalists are trying to stir up. Replacement theory was cited as the motivating factor by multiple mass murders. The guy who killed 10 Black people in Buffalo, person who shot up the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, person who drove to El Paso with the intent of killing Latinos, and who committed mass murder at a Walmart. Those were all based on the promotion of this idea of replacement theory, which says there's a conspiracy out there to replace white Americans, or legacy or Americans, however you want to use the term, with Black and brown people from the third world. That this is for some people, they cast it in anti-Semitic terms, that it's a Jewish plot. Some people say it's a liberal or democratic plot to replace conservative white Americans with there's there's different variations on that, but it's very harmful, and it's being used to stir up bigotry with really, literally very deadly consequences.
Well, and so as you're talking, here's the problem, right? This whole mental health causes mass shooters thing is something that I think, your work is doing the important work of revealing that's not true, right? You have all these psychiatrists being interviewed about mass shooters and are they mentally ill? And what you have them saying is, no, they actually, a lot of these people do not fit what the DSM-5 would categorize as any major mental illness. What they are is imbibing this replacement theory ideas about violence, this sense of white supremacy, this sense of, violence backed patriarchal whatever. It gets very weird very quickly. I mean, I don't need to tell you that, but whenever I fall into right wing Twitter, I'm like, what is this?
Yeah, I think
laugh, but it can get very weird.
it is weird, and I am not any kind of expert on mental health, and I know that people really have good reason to reject the fact that if when a shooter is white, they are more likely to suddenly have explanations made for them because that this is a mental health problem, and in some cases it may be a combination of things. I agree that the pandemic has been very hard on a lot of people in the country, and I think there is kind of a widespread mental health crisis that needs our attention. But what is the motivating factor behind a lot of these ideological mass murders is not mental health. It is that people have been manipulated and poisoned by ideology and by people who know how to manipulate people, who know how to identify their fears and their resentments, and people who are feeling like the country doesn't provide them the opportunities that they expected it would, that the structure of the economy is such that they are being left behind, or people like them are being left behind. Demagogues know how to find people like that and to make them blame the situation on others, and so to sort of focus people's anger and resentment on some kind of other. There's a long history of that being focused against Jewish people, against immigrants, against any out group that you want to think of, or any group that can be deemed as an other. And so the real problem is that we have irresponsible politicians and irresponsible political operatives who are more than willing to play up that kind of divisiveness, to try to manipulate people's fears, in hopes that it'll make them angry, it'll make them motivated to turn out and vote, and that it'll help right-wing candidates win elections. And it, sometimes it does that, and sometimes they're successful in achieving short-term political gains by doing that. I mean, we see that happening right now this year with all these campaigns against critical race theory, supposed critical race theory, where they're just stirring up all kinds of racial resentment with false attacks about the teaching of honest history in the country. We're seeing a huge wave of anti-LGBTQ attacks on any policies in schools that are affirming, or any books that have characters that LGBTQ students can relate to. It's all the same kind of strategy of authoritarianism, of fascism, to mobilize people against a perceived other, a perceived group that is a threat to quote real America or real Americans, and we see that really in spades right now. And Trump and some of Trump's advisors were brilliant at doing that, and we are living with the consequences of that, and we will be for a long time.
I love what you said about the blaming of the other, right? Because I think if you don't think in these terms, it's very difficult to wrap your mind around what is going on in people's heads where they're, but that's exactly, it's when we're unhappy, and I think we can all relate to this, right? When we're unhappy, it's a very natural emotional reaction to look for the source. But it's easier to blame other marginalized groups than it is to look up and be like, hey, actually, it's the people with tremendous amounts of power over you that are causing that. Because it's more psychologically comfortable to be like, ah, yes, it is the Mexicans. They have done this to me. When like that makes no sense. They're growing your food, man. You should be grateful. Or like the type of people they're angry about, not implying all Mexican immigrants are growing food. But you know what I'm trying to say? It baffles me that the people we should be the most grateful for, the people who are risking their lives to do really difficult jobs and underpaid, like those people should have all our solidarity, our support. We should be helping them get healthcare and better wages and everything. And instead, they're the recipients of this offloaded shame and violence. And it's baffling until you realize that people who are not doing well want to blame someone. And it's scary to realize that the people you need to blame actually are people with a lot of power, both political and economically, and very little empathy. That's a really scary thing to internalize. So we go after people that are comfortable. Peter, how do you suggest we get around this to build solidarity and realize that we're actually all on the same side?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, but it's an extremely important one. I think in some places you really and it's hard to do right now because people are so separated into their media bubbles, right? Mm-hmm. So many people on the right, conservatives, have been convinced that they should not trust or listen to mainstream media, and so they are only getting their news from Fox News or from outlets that are even more biased and less responsible, more irresponsible than Fox, and that's a big problem. So I think there's a lot of hard work to identify areas of common ground. I think one could be something like economic opportunity, because the country's economy in the last 40 years has been consistently restructured to devote more and more, to send more and more of the benefits of our economy to the very top, and it has hurt the middle class. It has hurt a lot of people, and people are hurting. Well, I think we could do a better job of pointing out that while Trump came in, talking like he was the voice of the forgotten Americans, that he was, positioning himself as the voice of the working class, and a lot of his supporters clearly fell for that and saw him as that. But what he and the Republicans did was pass a massive, massive tax cut for the wealthiest people in the country and corporations. $1 trillion that could have been used to put tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people to work, rebuilding the bridges and roads that are in terrible shape and doing the infrastructure work that Trump promised he was going to tackle for 4 years and never did. So I think that we need to find areas like that where we can talk about. One of the things that People for the American Way is working on right now is really trying to help communities find effective ways to reimagine and transform policing and public safety. And one of the ways to build broad enough coalitions to really do that and to take on the resistance from police unions is to recognize that authoritarian policing hurts all our communities. I mean, it's true that it falls hardest and most disproportionately on Black people and Black communities, and that should outrage us. But it's also true that there are more white people killed by police than Black people. Black people are more likely to, as a percentage of the population. But the problem of police violence and authoritarian policing cuts across all communities. And so we all have an incentive to come together to support creative policies to address that. And I think we need to do more of that kind of thinking and find ways to reach people on things that, they can feel and see and touch the difference that it makes in their lives. It's not an easy, there's no easy fix. And
I love I love what you're saying, Peter, because I think one of the things we do really poorly on the left is we try to get people to be these transcendent empathic beings. Like, you should care because it hurts this community. Like, nah, you should care because it's going to affect you. And maybe in ways you can't really wrap your head around at this current moment, but it's probably affecting you already. I have an activist friend who says a lot that whatever happens to marginalized racial groups will eventually happen to white people. And that should be if it's, or like you're saying with policing, I mean, that blows my mind as well, right? It's, police are not just violence against Black communities. And it's weird that we don't see more white activists in the streets about this, because yes, I mean, you should be really scared that the cops are committing street executions. That scares me. You should be afraid of that for your own children, even if you don't care about other people's.
Well, and it's interesting, and it goes back to a point that you made earlier about the importance of empathy. And it strikes me that is really important. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, you go back to the early days of our country, in our history, there are times when working class white and Black people rallied together against the oppression of the, plantation class in the South.
Yes.
And the elite saw that as the threat it was. And they, worked very hard to manufacture this racial divide between poor white people and between enslaved Black people. And so they sort of cultivated the sense of whiteness as a manufactured way, really as kind of a weapon of class warfare in some ways, and specifically as a way to tear down the walls of empathy and solidarity that existed. And so I think it is our task really to figure out how to find ways to rebuild those walls of solidarity and empathy. And it's hard, when you're dealing with, it's hard for me to sometimes feel that way about people that are, I see promoting things that are very damaging to the country. I'm a gay man. I'm married to the love of my life. And it's hard for me to, think about building bridges with people who want the Supreme Court to make my marriage illegal, who want to deny people like me the right to dignity and legal equality. It's tough, but we got to find ways to do it. I mean, just to circle back a little bit to the January 6th thing, one of the interesting things about the committee's choice to have all these witnesses be people who are Republicans is that it's forcing some of that discomfort and that disconnect, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy for people on the left to just sort of broadly hate Republicans, right? Or to broadly say, all Republicans are evil. But then you say, well, Mike Pence really saved us from a constitutional catastrophe because he did not give in to Trump's demand that he overthrow the election. And Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are really providing an incredibly important public service by calling out Trump on his lies and refusing to accept them. The lawyers who are testifying, who, it's hard for me to imagine having a lot in common with someone who was happy to work in the Trump White House or to work for Mike Pence.
Right.
But watching them testify, I can say, well, they do share a commitment to democracy on some level that I share. They do share some kind of a commitment to the Constitution that I share. So I think that that's a very interesting outcome of the way these hearings have been structured that had not occurred to me.
Well,
you see people joking on Twitter. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to like Liz Cheney now, and it's a joke, and it is kind of funny, but it's something deeper than that.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Peter. And I think if we have to, I was having this discussion with a friend yesterday about relationships and how, Twitter loves to be like, oh, this is a red flag, like men are all toxic and whatever, all this other stuff. And the internet age has really done a very good job of reducing people to black and white attributes and good and evil. And it's leading us to lose touch with how these things actually happen in this country. And we have to ask deeper questions than like, does this person politically align with me? It has to be more about, okay, we're in this situation. Like, let's just take the fall out of it. How do we get out of it? And we probably don't get out of it with the tools that got us here, which is black and white thinking, simplistic modes of just like knee-jerk reactions to other people. Because, to be clear, I'm not saying we embrace neo-Nazis, but there has to be, we have to get curious about why these people were able to grab so much political power. And some of it's pretty straightforward, right? Money, corruption, and that part. But there's more to it than that, right? And if we're going to build an America that is safe for people of all races and orientations and genders, it's, we can't just be like, oh, the other side is bad. We've been doing that for a while and it hasn't worked. I wish it worked because I do believe that. But well, so with your work, you're the head of this, you're the expert on how this stuff happens, right? So what is y'all's process for figuring this all out, and what can people like do to stay informed from all your insights and everything?
Well, people can follow us on Twitter, which is at Right Wing Watch, or we're on Facebook, and we have a website blog, rightwingwatch.org. People for the American Way site is also a place where we offer folks ways to engage in activism on behalf of democracy and pro-democratic reforms, ways to get involved in issues like transforming public safety in a way that makes all of our communities safer. So you can find us online, and we're happy to connect with you. Now, in terms of I am more the expert on trying to document and analyze what the right's up to. I'm not an expert on how you get people out of those rabbit holes. How to I am not immune from having family members who have gone down the QAnon rabbit hole. But there are groups out there who are really working on those things. There are groups that are devoted to helping people find their way out of white supremacy that they got sucked into as a teenager or a young person, got sucked into some extremist groups online. And there are folks who are working on figuring out how you reach those people and get them out. There are groups out there that try to set up community conversations, intentionally chosen between a group of conservatives in a community and a group of liberals in a community, just to get them talking, because that used to happen more organically. People went to church with folks who had disagreements with them politically, or maybe their kids played on a basketball team with someone who was a Democrat and someone who's Republican. Those kind of things were ways that people made the more human connections. And I think as our communities have literally physically become more polarized, people have moved into communities that are more full of people who think like them. The rise of social media has made it easier for people to just be aligned in bubbles with people who think like them. And then the pandemic just made all of that harder and made people feel more isolated. And that makes people more vulnerable to the kinds of unprincipled manipulation that there are unfortunately plenty of people out there that are willing to do, either for power or for profit or both.
Well, and I think sometimes when people are upset, because we live in very upsetting times, wage stagnation, healthcare inequality, climate anxiety, there are all these structural issues that are pressing in on people who even like maybe are pretty privileged, relatively speaking. This is not an easy time to be alive. And it's way easier to create like venture frustration at, oh, the Democrats are why it's like this, than to live in the complicated, wow, things are kind of bad right now, And I don't know how it got to be this bad. When I was a kid, it wasn't this bad. And it's a difficult time that we're navigating. And I'm really glad that you are documenting what they're up to, because I know it can't always be easy.
That's true. It is sometimes a challenge, and we know that people who do research on extremism can sometimes have that take a toll on their own well-being. But it's like most things in life. We need to find a way to be both and, right? Mm-hmm. Because we do need to find a way. I mean, it's really important from my perspective, just for our immediate future, for the health of our democracy. It's really important that we not let the Trump kind of Republicans get more power in this country. They already have too much. They're already causing great harm. And so there's a real need to just mobilize people around that and around a different vision of America, that's not we don't want the country to go backwards. We want a more inclusive America where prosperity and freedom are shared with everybody. And so it's very important to organize around that politically. And then in the longer sense, we do have to figure out, how we live together and how we get a greater consensus that that's the kind of country we want, where you're not just trying to protect freedom and opportunity for people like you, but that you think that what makes America great is that we have a country when everybody shares in our prosperity and shares in freedom and opportunity. And that's the goal, is getting there. Some days it feels like we're far from it. We're about to have some really hard days ahead around with the Supreme Court getting ready to overturn Roe v. Wade. And, just the consequences of that playing out across the states and across people who need healthcare. We're going to have some really hard, devastating fights. But, we always have to stay in this for the long haul.
Well, thank you so much for all you're doing, Peter. I hope we have another conversation soon, maybe as the hearings wrap up. And
sure.
What's the desired outcome? Like, what's the desired likely outcome, I should say, from all this?
Well, to me, the best outcome of the hearings would be that, fair-minded Americans, maybe people who are not, obsessively political, either the left or the right, really get a sense that here's a group of people who's trying to tell the truth. And the truth is very clear that Donald Trump lied to his supporters. He conned them. Because of that, hundreds of them have criminal records now, in jail time, because Trump lied to them and convinced them that they had a duty to come and try to overturn the election. That he has stolen millions of dollars of them with his fraudulent fundraising for election defense fund that didn't exist. I mean, that's one of the interesting things that's come out recently. So I'm just hoping that maybe it'll some of this truth-telling from the committee will sink in spite of the efforts by Trump's people and right-wing media to downplay and discredit the commission. And then I hope that the Justice Department continues to bring charges against people, not just on the people who were breaking the windows and injuring police and vandalizing the Capitol, but the people who were really conspiring to undercut our democracy and conspiring to create a crime against the country, which was to steal the election from the people who voted for Joe Biden.
Amen. I don't think those people should hold elected office. Hot take, any of them. It's my controversial takeaway from all this.
I'm with you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, and look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks so much for having me.